The heavy silence in Henry Thompson's office was suffocating. The polished mahogany desk, the walls lined with awards and certificates, and the soft ticking of his grandfather's clock added to the oppressive atmosphere. Richard sat across from his father, jaw clenched, refusing to meet Henry's cold, calculating gaze. "I've had enough of your games, Richard," Henry finally said, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Your reckless behavior, the parties, the women, the money spent on God knows what. It ends now." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his designer suit feeling like a cage. He had heard his father speak like this dozens of times, but something about the steel in Henry's tone sent shivers down his spine. "Dad, Richard started, but Henry held up a hand to silence him. "You've squandered enough chances," Henry interrupted, leaning forward. His piercing gaze bore into his son. "Do you think I built this empire for you to tarnish it with your irresponsibility? I worked too hard, sacrificed too much. You are 32 years old, Richard. It's time to grow up." Richard smirked, masking his unease with arrogance. "What is this? Another lecture? Come on, Dad. I'm your son. What are you going to do? Cut me off?" Henry's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. "Wait, you're serious?" he said, his voice rising. "Dead serious," Henry replied, standing and pacing behind his desk. "You've proven you can't handle responsibility. You're dragging the family name through the mud. So, here's how this is going to work. You'll marry by the end of the month. Not to some socialite or trust fund heiress, but to someone grounded, someone who understands the value of hard work. Until then, your accounts are frozen. Every last cent." Richard stared at his father, dumbfounded. "Mary? Are you insane? You can't force me to do that." "Oh, but I can," Henry said, his voice dangerously calm. "And I will. You want your inheritance? You want to continue living the way you do? Then prove to me you're not a waste of everything I've built." Richard's mind reeled. His father's fortune was legendary, billions in real estate, technology investments, and global ventures. The thought of losing it all felt like the ground was being ripped from under him. "You can't just pick someone for me," Richard spat, his tone defiant. "I already have," Henry said, his words landing like a bombshell. He slid a manila folder across the desk. Richard hesitated before opening it, his stomach churning. Inside was a photograph of a young woman standing in a field, her auburn hair blowing in the wind. She was holding a basket of apples, her smile warm and genuine. The name below the photo read, Samantha Reed. "She's a farmer," Henry said matter-of-factly. "Runs her family's orchard upstate. She has no interest in your world of excess, which is exactly why I chose her." Richard shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane. You want me to marry some farmer? What am I supposed to have in common with her? What about love? What about choice?" Henry's expression hardened. "You made your choices, Richard, and they've all been disastrous. This isn't about love. It's about discipline, responsibility, and showing me you're capable of committing to something bigger than yourself. You have until the end of the month. Otherwise, you'll be on your own, with nothing." The encounter 2 days later, Richard found himself driving through the countryside in his sleek black sports car. The contrast between his usual world of penthouses and private jets and the quiet, winding roads of upstate was jarring. He clenched the steering wheel, fuming at the absurdity of the situation. As he approached the Reed family orchard, the sight of sprawling green fields and neatly lined apple trees only fueled his frustration. The quaint farmhouse at the heart of the property looked like something out of a postcard, picturesque, simple, and utterly foreign to Richard's life. He parked near the house and stepped out, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the dirt. The sound of a dog barking startled him, and he turned to see a golden retriever bounding toward him, followed by the woman from the photograph. Samantha Reed looked even more radiant in person. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her face was free of makeup, her cheeks flushed from the sun. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves, her boots caked with dirt. "Can I help you?" she called out, her tone polite but wary. Richard adjusted his sunglasses, trying to muster his usual charm. "Hi, I'm Richard Thompson. I believe my father spoke to you." Recognition flashed across Samantha's face, followed by something else, displeasure. "Yes, he called," she said, crossing her arms. "I told him I wasn't interested." Richard blinked. "Excuse me? I don't know what kind of deal you and your father have going on," Samantha continued, her tone firm. "But I'm not marrying a stranger, especially not one who thinks he can buy his way into my life." Richard bristled. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by someone like her. "Look, I didn't ask for this either. Trust me, this is the last place I want to be. But if we could just—" "I'm not a part of your world, Mr. Thompson," Samantha interrupted. "And I have no intention of being dragged into it." Richard opened his mouth to retort but stopped when an older man emerged from the farmhouse, wiping his hands on a rag. "Everything okay, Sam?" the man asked, his eyes narrowing at Richard. "It's fine, Dad," Samantha said, her tone softening slightly. "He was just leaving." Richard glanced between the two of them, realizing he wasn't going to win this round. He exhaled sharply and turned back to his car. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath as he drove away. Samantha's determined expression burned into his memory. A shocking twist that night. Back in his penthouse, Richard poured himself a drink, trying to make sense of the day's events. Samantha's rejection wasn't just humiliating. It was a challenge. He pulled out the photograph of her from the folder and studied it. There was something about her, something real and grounded, that unsettled him. She was everything he wasn't, and maybe that was why his father had chosen her. As he set the photo down, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Henry. How did it go? Richard stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. After a moment, he replied, "She said no. But don't worry, I'll handle it." Richard spent the next morning stewing over Samantha's outright rejection. He wasn't used to hearing the word no, and the fact that she had dismissed him so easily gnawed at him. But more than that, he couldn't shake her face from his mind. Those defiant eyes that dared him to prove he was more than the spoiled, shallow man she clearly thought he was. Sitting in his penthouse, surrounded by luxury that now felt meaningless, Richard knew he couldn't let this go. He had a month to pull this off, or his entire life as he knew it would crumble. But how was he supposed to convince someone like Samantha, who seemed immune to everything that had always worked for him? That evening, armed with nothing but determination and a reluctant sense of humility, Richard found himself driving back to the Reed family orchard. The second attempt this time, Samantha was on a ladder in the middle of the orchard, plucking ripe apples and dropping them into a basket below. She didn't notice Richard until he was standing at the base of the ladder, looking up at her. "Are you following me now?" she called down, her voice tinged with annoyance. Richard raised his hands in mock surrender. "I come in peace. I promise." Samantha climbed down slowly, brushing her hands off on her jeans before crossing her arms. "Let me guess. Your dad sent you back to convince me?" "No," Richard said, his tone softer than she expected. "This is all me. I wanted to talk. Hear me out, and if you still want me to leave, I'll go." Samantha hesitated. There was something different in his tone, something almost genuine. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Fine. Talk." An unexpected connection. Richard took a deep breath. "Look, I know this whole thing is insane. Trust me, I didn't ask to be thrown into this either. My dad's trying to control my life because he thinks I've been a screw-up, and maybe he's right. But I'm trying to fix it. And apparently, fixing it involves convincing you to, marry me." Samantha raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Not exactly the most romantic proposal I've ever heard." Richard chuckled, a sound that surprised even him. "Yeah, I guess I need to work on that." Samantha sighed. "Why me? Why does your dad think this is a good idea?" Richard hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I think he sees you as everything I'm not. Grounded, responsible, real." Samantha tilted her head, studying him. And what do you see me as? The question caught Richard off guard. For a moment, he didn't have an answer. Then, quietly, he said, I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. Something in his voice made Samantha pause. There was no arrogance this time, no bravado, just honesty. I don't believe in arranged marriages, she said firmly. And I'm not going to change my mind just because you show up here with a sad story. I'm not asking you to marry me today, Richard replied quickly. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the person you think I am. Samantha hesitated. She had always been a good judge of character, and something about Richard's tone told her he was serious. Still, the idea of being a pawn in someone else's game made her stomach turn. What's in it for me? She asked, crossing her arms. Richard grinned, sensing the tiniest crack in her defenses. How about this? Give me 1 week to prove I'm worth your time. No promises, no strings. Just 1 week. If you're still not convinced, I'll leave you alone. Deal? Samantha narrowed her eyes, weighing his words. Finally, she sighed. 1 week. But don't think for a second that I'm going to make this easy for you. Richard smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. The first day, true to her word, Samantha didn't make things easy. The next morning, Richard showed up at the orchard dressed in designer sneakers and a crisp button-down shirt, only to be handed a pair of work boots and gloves. If you're going to be here, you're going to work, Samantha said, thrusting a basket into his hands. Work? Richard repeated, staring at her in disbelief. Yeah, you know, that thing people do to earn a living, Samantha shot back, rolling her eyes. Start with the apples, and try not to drop them. By midday, Richard was sweating through his shirt, his arms sore from carrying baskets back and forth. Samantha watched from a distance, suppressing a smile as he fumbled with the ladder and nearly toppled into a tree. You look like you're enjoying this, Richard muttered as she approached. I am, Samantha admitted, smirking, but I'll give you credit, you haven't quit yet. That's because I'm stubborn, Richard said, wiping his brow. That makes two of us, Samantha replied, her tone softer than before. A glimpse of vulnerability later that evening, Samantha found Richard sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the setting sun. She hesitated before joining him, handing him a glass of water. Thanks, Richard said, his voice quiet. They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them easing slightly. You know, Samantha said finally, most guys like you would have given up by now. Richard chuckled. Most guys like me? You know what I mean, she said, rolling her eyes. Rich, entitled, used to getting their way. Richard sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You're not wrong. I've been that guy for most of my life. But I don't want to be him anymore. Samantha glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Why not? Because it's empty, Richard admitted. The parties, the money, the people who only stick around because of my last name. It's all meaningless. I've been coasting for years and now, I don't even know who I am without my dad's money. Samantha didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. Figuring out who you are doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen because someone else tells you who to be. Richard looked at her, the warmth of her words catching him off guard. Maybe you're right, he said. But for now, I'll settle for figuring out how to survive a week on this farm. Samantha laughed, a sound that made Richard's chest tighten unexpectedly. An unseen threat as the week went on, Richard began to adapt to life on the farm. He learned how to sort apples, repair fences, and even milk a cow, though not without a fair share of mishaps. But just as things started to shift between him and Samantha, a shadow loomed on the horizon. One evening, as Samantha locked up the barn, a sleek black car pulled up to the driveway. The man who stepped out was sharply dressed, his expression cold and calculating. Who's that? Richard asked, stepping out of the house. Samantha's expression darkened. That's Martin. He works for your father. Richard's stomach sank as Martin approached, a folder in his hand and a smirk on his face. Mr. Thompson sends his regards, Martin said smoothly, handing the folder to Richard. He thought you might need a little. incentive to speed things along. Richard opened the folder, his blood running cold as he scanned the contents. Inside were documents outlining Samantha's financial struggles, a mortgage on the verge of foreclosure, mounting bills, and a struggling orchard barely breaking even. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp. "Your father's way of reminding you what's at stake," Martin replied. Richard's hands clenched into fists as he looked at Samantha, whose face was a mix of anger and betrayal. "What the hell is going on, Richard?" she asked, her voice shaking. Richard met her gaze, guilt tightening in his chest. He didn't have an answer. Samantha's hands shook as she clutched the documents Richard had handed her. The neatly printed text spelled out everything she'd worked so hard to conceal. Her family's financial struggles, the overdue mortgage, the mounting pressure to sell the orchard to developers who had been circling for years like vultures. "What is this?" Samantha demanded, her voice taut with anger. Richard hesitated, the weight of his father's manipulation crashing down on him. It's leverage," he admitted reluctantly. "My father must have been digging into your finances to push this marriage. He knew you wouldn't agree unless what?" Samantha snapped, her eyes blazing. "Unless he dangled your money in front of me like a lifeline?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He hated the truth of it, hated that his father had weaponized Samantha's vulnerability to further his agenda. "Get off my property," Samantha said, her voice trembling with fury. "Samantha, wait," Richard pleaded, stepping closer. "No," she shouted, her voice echoing through the quiet fields. "I trusted you, Richard. I let you into my life, and this is what I get? You and your father trying to buy me out like I'm some asset." Richard felt his stomach twist. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said quietly. "I didn't know about any of this until tonight. I swear." Samantha's laughter was bitter. "How convenient. Go back to your father, Richard. Tell him his plan failed. I'm not for sale." Before Richard could say another word, she turned and stormed back toward the house, slamming the door behind her. The confrontation the next morning. Richard returned to the city, his frustration boiling over. He barged into his father's office without knocking, slamming the folder onto Henry's desk. "What the hell is this?" Richard demanded. Henry looked up from his paperwork, unbothered by his son's outburst. "Good morning to you too, Richard. Don't play games with me," Richard snapped. "You used her financial troubles against her? You didn't think I'd find out?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression calm and calculated. "She's a smart woman, Richard. She'll figure out that working with us is her best option. This isn't personal, it's business." "Business?" Richard echoed incredulously. "You've stooped to blackmail, and you call it business?" Henry's eyes narrowed. "Careful, son. You're treading on dangerous ground." Richard stared at his father, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "This isn't about me growing up, is it? It's about control. You couldn't care less about me or Samantha. This is just another deal to you." Henry smirked. "You're finally catching on, and if you're smart, you'll stop fighting it. That orchard is a prime piece of land, and if Samantha marries you, she's more likely to sell it. Everyone wins." "Except her," Richard shot back. Henry's expression turned cold. "She's already losing, Richard. You'd be doing her a favor by stepping in and making her problems go away. Or would you rather see her fail on her own?" The words stung, and Richard hated that part of him believed them. He turned on his heel and left the office without another word, his mind racing. A new resolve by the time Richard returned to the orchard. Samantha was waiting for him, her arms crossed and her expression guarded. "I thought I told you to leave," she said coldly. "I'm not here to make excuses," Richard said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make things right." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Richard took a deep breath. "By telling you the truth. My father's plan was never about us. It was about your land. He wants to buy out the orchard, and he thought marrying me to you would make it easier." Samantha's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "I didn't know about the money," Richard continued. but I'm not going to let him use it against you. I want to help, Samantha. Not because of him, but because I care about what happens to you. To this place. Samantha stared at him, her emotions flickering across her face. Anger, suspicion, and something else, something softer. And why should I believe you? She asked. Because I'm not walking away, Richard said simply. I'll help you fight him, even if it means cutting ties with my father for good. The partnership Samantha didn't agree immediately. It took hours of conversation, reluctant trust, and Richard rolling up his sleeves to help with the day's work before she finally relented. You can stay, she said, wiping sweat from her brow after repairing a broken fence post. But if you so much as hint at siding with your father, you're out. Deal, Richard said, offering her a small smile. As the days passed, Richard began to see Samantha's world in a new light. The orchard wasn't just a business, it was a legacy. Every tree, every harvest told a story of hard work, resilience, and love. And as he worked alongside Samantha, learning the rhythms of her life, Richard started to feel something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Henry strikes back, but Henry Thompson wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily. When Richard ignored his calls, Henry escalated. First, he sent lawyers to Samantha's property with offers to buy the land outright. When she refused, the offers turned into thinly veiled threats, zoning restrictions, inspections, anything that could make her life harder. One afternoon, as Samantha and Richard unloaded crates of apples, a black SUV pulled up to the driveway. I'll handle this, Richard said, stepping forward. Martin, Henry's right-hand man, climbed out of the vehicle, his expression smug. Your father's not happy, Richard. He thought you'd have this wrapped up by now. Tell him it's over, Richard said firmly. He's not getting the orchard, and I'm not playing his games anymore. Martin's smirk didn't waver. You think this is about you? Your father doesn't need you to close this deal. He's already found another way. Richard's stomach sank. What are you talking about? Martin handed him an envelope. Inside were documents showing that Henry had filed for foreclosure on the orchard's mortgage, using an obscure clause in the original agreement. He'll own the land by the end of the month, Martin said casually. Unless, of course, Samantha decides to sell voluntarily. It would be a lot less messy. Richard's hands clenched into fists as Martin turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the driveway, his chest burning with frustration. A new plan that evening, Richard and Samantha sat in the farmhouse kitchen, the foreclosure notice spread out on the table between them. I'm sorry, Richard said, his voice heavy with guilt. This is my fault. I brought him here. It's not your fault, Samantha said, though her voice was laced with exhaustion. Your father would have found a way, with or without you. We're not giving up, Richard said firmly. There has to be a way to fight this. Samantha looked at him, her eyes tired but determined. If we're going to fight, we'll need a plan. And it has to be airtight. As they worked late into the night, poring over financial records and legal documents, Richard felt something shift between them. Samantha wasn't just a reluctant partner anymore. She was an ally. And for the first time, Richard realized he didn't just want to help her save the orchard. He wanted to save her. The tension on the Reed orchard was palpable as the days ticked down to Henry's foreclosure deadline. Richard and Samantha worked tirelessly, poring over financial records, consulting with lawyers, and strategizing ways to fight back. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the pressure was taking its toll. For Samantha, it wasn't just about saving the land. This orchard was her family's legacy, her entire identity. For Richard, it was a chance to prove he was more than his father's pawn, a chance to fight for something real, for Samantha and for himself. But Henry Thompson wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let others outmaneuver him. And as Richard and Samantha dug deeper into the legal fight, they uncovered secrets that shook the very foundation of their alliance. A shocking discovery late one evening. Samantha was sorting through a box of old financial documents her late father had kept in the barn. The papers were yellowed with age, but she hoped they might contain something, anything, that could help her fight the foreclosure. Richard walked in, wiping grease from his hands after repairing a tractor. Find anything? Not yet, Samantha muttered, flipping through another stack of invoices. But I'm starting to think the answer might be buried in here. As she reached the bottom of the box, Samantha froze. There, tucked between two envelopes, was a contract she didn't recognize. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and read the fine print. Her voice wavered. Richard, you need to see this. He leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the document. At first, it didn't seem unusual, a standard business agreement between her father and a local investor. But as Richard read further, his face darkened. This investor, he said, pointing to the signature. It's my father. Samantha's head shot up, her eyes wide with shock. What? Richard grabbed the document and read it again, his chest tightening. Henry Thompson was one of your father's silent partners. He helped fund the orchard's expansion 20 years ago. Samantha snatched the paper from his hands, her mind racing. That doesn't make sense. My father always said he built this orchard from scratch. He probably didn't want you to know, Richard said grimly. But look here, this clause. It gives my father the right to reclaim the land under certain conditions. This is what he's using to justify the foreclosure. Samantha felt the blood drain from her face. You're saying your father planned this? That he set my family up for failure decades ago? Richard shook his head, his voice low. I don't know if he planned it back then, but he's definitely using it now. And if we don't figure out a way to nullify this contract, he'll win. A growing rift, the discovery of Henry's involvement, drove a wedge between Richard and Samantha. For Samantha, it felt like another betrayal, proof that Richard's presence in her life was tainted by his father's schemes. How can I trust you? Samantha demanded, her voice breaking as they argued in the farmhouse kitchen. Your father has been pulling the strings this entire time, and now you want me to believe you're not a part of it? Richard's frustration boiled over. I didn't know about any of this. I've been trying to help you, Samantha. I've been fighting him every step of the way. Samantha shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Maybe you didn't know, but you're still tied to him. And now everything I've worked for, everything my family built, is at risk because of your name. Richard's heart ached at the accusation, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. You think I wanted this, he said quietly. You think I wanted to find out that my father's been lying to me too? I've been just as blindsided as you. But Samantha wasn't ready to forgive. She turned away from him, her shoulders trembling. I need some time to think. Alone. Richard nodded reluctantly, his chest heavy with regret. Take all the time you need, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry's offer the next day. Samantha received an unexpected visitor. Henry Thompson arrived unannounced, stepping out of a sleek black car with his ever-present assistant, Martin, in tow. Samantha stood on the porch, her arms crossed as Henry approached with a polished smile. Ms. Reed, he said smoothly, thank you for agreeing to meet me. I didn't, Samantha said coldly. Henry chuckled. Fair enough. But I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. Samantha didn't invite him in, but she didn't send him away either. Henry took that as permission to continue. I understand this situation has been stressful for you, Henry said, but I'm here to offer a solution. Samantha's jaw tightened. I'm not interested in anything you have to offer. Don't be so hasty, Henry said, his tone almost patronizing. If you agree to sell the orchard, I'll not only forgive the foreclosure, but I'll also pay you enough to start fresh anywhere you want. You could leave all of this behind and live a comfortable life. Isn't that what you want? Samantha's eyes blazed with fury. What I want is for you to leave my land and my life alone. Henry's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. Think carefully, Ms. Reed. This is the best deal you're going to get. Refuse, and I'll take the land anyway. But if you play your cards right, you can come out ahead. Samantha clenched her fists, her mind racing. She knew Henry was serious. His resources far outstripped her own. But there was no way she was going to let him win. You're underestimating me, Mr. Thompson, she said icily. I won't be bullied. Henry's expression hardened. Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you. A betrayal revealed that evening. Richard returned to the orchard, determined to mend the rift between him and Samantha. But as soon as he stepped onto the porch, she confronted him with fire in her eyes. "Your father was here," she said, her voice sharp. Richard's stomach dropped. "What? What did he say?" "He offered to buy me out," Samantha said, her anger barely contained. "And he made it very clear that if I don't agree, he'll take the orchard anyway." Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I had no idea he was coming. I swear, Samantha, I'm not working with him." "Then prove it," Samantha interrupted. "Cut ties with him. Walk away from his money, his influence, everything." Richard froze. He had expected her anger, but not this ultimatum. "It's not that simple," he said finally. "If I walk away, I lose everything. The company, the trust fund, my entire future." "Your future?" Samantha spat. "What about mine? What about my family's legacy? Or doesn't that matter as much as your comfortable lifestyle?" Richard flinched, her words hitting harder than he expected. "It's not about the money," he said quietly. "It's about proving that I can stand on my own, that I'm more than just his son." "Then prove it," Samantha said again, her voice softer this time. "Because right now, I don't know if I can trust you." A desperate gamble as the foreclosure deadline loomed. Richard knew he had to make a choice. His father's influence was a shadow he couldn't escape, but if he wanted to save Samantha and himself, he would have to take a risk that could cost him everything. Late that night, Richard made a decision. He called Charles, his father's assistant, and arranged a meeting with Henry. "If you want to take this orchard," Richard said coldly, "you're going to have to go through me." Richard arrived at his father's estate just before midnight, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. The sprawling mansion loomed in the darkness, its grand facade lit by the soft glow of exterior lights. It was a fitting reflection of Henry Thompson himself, imposing, calculated, and designed to intimidate. The butler opened the door before Richard could knock, ushering him into the cavernous study where Henry was already waiting. "Richard," Henry said smoothly, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand, "to what do I owe the pleasure of this late-night visit?" Richard stepped forward, his jaw tight. "We need to talk." Henry gestured to the chair opposite him. "By all means, sit." "I'll stand," Richard said sharply. Henry raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Very well. Let's hear it." Richard took a deep breath. "You're going to back off. No more foreclosure, no more threats. You leave the orchard and Samantha alone." Henry chuckled, the sound low and condescending. "And why would I do that? The land is mine by right. I'm simply taking what's owed to me." Richard's fists clenched. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you lose a lot more than the orchard." Henry leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Oh? And what exactly do you think you can do to me, son?" Richard pulled out a folder from his jacket and tossed it onto the desk. Henry's smug expression faltered as he opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. "These are records of the shell companies you used to siphon funds from your early investors," Richard said, his voice steady. "Bank transfers, falsified contracts, and testimony from a former associate who's more than willing to go public." Henry's face darkened. "You've been digging into my past." "Call it evening the playing field," Richard said. "If you move forward with the foreclosure, I'll make sure every one of these documents is sent to the SEC, the IRS, and every journalist in the city." Henry slammed the folder shut, his jaw tightening. "You destroy your own family? You're the one who built this family on lies," Richard shot back. "I'm just exposing the truth." The tension between them was electric, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Henry stood, his towering presence meant to intimidate, but Richard held his ground. "You think you're clever," Henry said coldly, "but you don't have the stomach for this fight. You've always been soft, Richard. That's why you're standing here, trying to save a piece of dirt instead of building something meaningful." "This isn't just about the orchard," Richard said, his voice rising. "This is about showing you, and myself, that I don't need you. Not your money, not your power, and certainly not your approval. For a moment, Henry said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a thin, calculating grin. "You've grown a spine," he said. "I'll give you that. Is that a yes?" Richard pressed. Henry chuckled. "You think you've won, don't you? Fine. I'll withdraw the foreclosure. But don't think for a second that this is over. You've made an enemy of me tonight, Richard. And I don't forgive easily." Richard stared at his father, his heart pounding. He knew Henry's words weren't an empty threat, but for the first time, he felt unafraid. "I'm not looking for forgiveness," Richard said, turning on his heel. "I'm looking for freedom." A risky revelation the next morning, Richard returned to the orchard with the news. Samantha was skeptical at first, her arms crossed as she listened to his explanation. "So, just like that, he's backing off?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "Not just like that," Richard admitted. "I had to give him some incentive." "What kind of incentive?" Richard hesitated before pulling out the folder. "I dug into his past, found things he didn't want anyone to know. I used it to force his hand." Samantha's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. "You blackmailed your own father?" "I didn't see another choice," Richard said quietly. "He wasn't going to stop unless I gave him a reason to." Samantha closed the folder, her expression softening. "You really did this for me?" Richard met her gaze. "For you, for the orchard, and for me. I'm done being his puppet, Samantha." A tentative smile broke across her face, and for the first time in weeks, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Henry's retaliation, but Henry Thompson wasn't a man to take defeat lying down. A week after withdrawing the foreclosure, he made his next move. Samantha received a letter from the county zoning board, informing her that the orchard's operations were under review due to a series of environmental concerns raised by an anonymous party. "What does this mean?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking as she handed the letter to Richard. "It means my father's playing dirty," Richard said grimly. "Again." Over the next few days, inspectors arrived on the property, scrutinizing every aspect of the orchard's operations. They cited minor infractions, issuing fines and threatening further action. It was clear Henry was trying to bleed Samantha dry through bureaucracy. But Richard was ready. Using his connections, he reached out to local environmental experts and community leaders, rallying support for the orchard. He organized meetings, wrote letters, and even appeared at a town hall to defend the farm's importance to the community. Samantha watched in awe as Richard transformed from a man shackled by his father's influence to a fierce advocate for her and the orchard. "You're really something, you know that?" she said one evening as they worked on an appeal together. Richard smiled, his confidence growing. "I had a good teacher." Victory. At last the zoning board eventually ruled in Samantha's favor, dismissing the complaints as baseless. The victory was a turning point, not just for the orchard, but for Richard and Samantha's relationship. One evening, as they stood together beneath the stars, Richard took her hand. "I don't know what comes next," he said softly, "but I know I want to face it with you." Samantha smiled, leaning into him. "I think we've both earned a fresh start." Epilogue. A legacy reclaimed months later, the orchard was thriving. Samantha and Richard had formed a true partnership, blending her expertise with his strategic acumen to expand the business. Henry, true to his word, didn't forgive or forget, but Richard no longer cared. For the first time, he felt free to build a life on his own terms. As they stood together, watching the sun set over the orchard, Samantha turned to Richard. "Do you think your father ever expected this?" she asked. Richard smiled, squeezing her hand. "Not in a million years." And for the first time in his life, Richard was grateful for the path that had brought him here, because it had led him to her.